Fourth of July. It's a great time for picnics, fireworks, cooking out, and barbecuing. I'm going to show you an easy recipe for some fantastic ribs that will make you the hit of any gathering this holiday. And since summertime is the time for fresh corn, we're going to be making some simple grilled corn on the cob to go with our ribs. I call them Independence ribs, and that's next on Chef Jack ATL. Nothing is better than ribs that are fall off the bone tender and still very juicy. The fall off the bone tender part comes from the way we cook the ribs. Keeping the meat moist comes from a process called brining, which we do before we season or cook the meat. Brines are a great way to introduce moisture and flavor into meat, and they require very few ingredients. I like to use orange spice tea, although any tea practically will work to help import a light and floral flavor. We want our water to be warm enough to seep the tea in, but not boiling. It's not necessary to have boiling water. Also, I'm making a concentrated brine batch here. I'm later going to add a quart of water to this concentrate. When brining, you don't want to go overboard with the salt or with the sugar. The idea is to get the meat to hold moisture and to improve the flavor, not overpower it. So here we have a great rack of ribs, and we're going to clean it up a little bit before brining. What we're going to do is we're going to take some of the fat off the end, but not a whole lot because we want the fat to contribute to the flavor and moisture. Now it's important to remember what part of the pig this comes from. It's from an area between the loin and the belly called the spare ribs, and there's a lot of connective tissue here which can be very tough if not cooked properly. But it'll also give us the fall off the bone tenderness we want if we cook it slowly and at low heat to break down that connective tissue. This longer cooking time is why we need to make sure that we keep the meat moist by putting it in a brine. And what we're going to do is basically trim off these extra flaps of meat and cut right down to the ribs, which should be fairly easy to go through. This way we end up with a nice even rack of ribs, and that'll help us both in the cooking process and in creating a great presentation. Now the scrap meat is not really scrap. It's really good, and we're going to brine and cook it the same way we're going to brine and cook the ribs. But when it comes to cooking, we're going to use a little bit less time on these scraps because the bones aren't going to be contributing to any of the holding of the moisture or any of the temperature regulation. If we cook the scrap the same time and temperature that we do the ribs, we're going to overcook them and they'll be a little dry and stringy and not quite as enjoyable. Now I'm going to brine these ribs and keep them under refrigeration for about 12 hours. I'm going to add some mixed peppercorns in here, about a quarter of a cup, to just add to the flavor. I'm not going to add any salt. If I wanted to, I could add some aromatics like bay leaf or things like that, but I've got the orange spice marinade, so I'm going to be relying on the flavors from that. If you remember, I made a concentrate of that and said I was later going to add a quart of water to sort of thin it out. That's simply because it's easier for me to store a concentrated quart of brine that I can add water to rather than to just try and store 2 quarts of brine until I need it. I just want to make sure that the meat is fully connected with the brine, make sure that it is well awash of it, that as much of it as possible is submerged, and then I'm just going to put a top on it and put it in the refrigerator for 24 hours. While the ribs are brining, I'm going to go ahead and create the dry rub I'm going to put on them after I take them out of the brine before I go into the cooking process. This includes a molasses, coriander, paprika, granulated honey, garlic powder, cumin, powdered sage, a salt and pepper mix, and chili powder. I'm going to add all of the dry ingredients into a bowl and then mix them together thoroughly. I won't be including the molasses at this stage. The molasses is going to be brushed onto the ribs, and that's going to give the spices something to stick to. Once all the spices and seasonings have been thoroughly mixed together, I'm going to put this spice rub into a sealed container and just wait until the ribs have finished marinating. And here are our ribs after about a 24-hour brine. I rinsed them off with fresh water and took off all the peppercorns. I'm now going to brush a layer of molasses syrup on them to add to the flavor and to give the spices something to stick to. Once the ribs have been seasoned, I can wrap them up and refrigerate them for a couple of more days, or I can wrap them tightly and freeze them for use at a later date. However, it's 4th of July, so we're going to be getting these guys on the grill. I'm using a propane outdoor grill because hey, it's summertime and this is the season for cooking outdoors. Also, these ribs are going to generate a lot of smoke and I really don't want to smoke up my kitchen that much. I'm cooking these ribs for about 6 minutes on each side over high heat. When they're done, I'm going to take them off the heat, turn the grill off, and bring them inside to finish them low and slow in the oven. For me personally, bourbon and barbecue are natural matches. They both have elements of smokiness, sweetness, and earthiness. I tend to include a little bit of bourbon in just about all the barbecuing I do. Here, I'm going to pour about 2 ounces of my favorite bourbon, Maker's Mark, over the ribs and let some of that liquid fall to the bottom of the pan and slowly cook along with the meat. I'm using a roasting pan with a grate at the bottom. That's going to keep the ribs off the bottom of the pan so they don't get too hot on the bottom side. This will also allow the fat and other liquids to run off and keep the ribs from stewing in them. I'm going to put a matching pan over the top of this one because I don't want an airtight seal. Covering it tightly with a lid or aluminum foil would lead to steaming, and what I want is a dry roasting. So I want to give the steam a way to escape from the pan. I'm going to set my oven temperature for 250 degrees for a low, slow cook, and I'm going to cook the ribs in the oven for about 3 hours. Three hours later, and the low, slow heat has broken down all that connective tissue and left us with fall-off-the-bone tender meat. Now, a small piece at the end always has to be sacrificed as a taste test. It pulls away very easily from the bone, and the meat is still nice and juicy. Perfect. We're now going to apply a thick layer of barbecue sauce, and you can use your favorite barbecue sauce or you can make one of your own. I've got a specialty one that I use. We're just going to brush this on nice and thick. Because it's summertime, because we're barbecuing, and because we're using the outdoor grill, we're going to grill some corn on the cob. I've cut the tops off this corn, and I'm using some butcher's twine to tie the husk close against the cob. This is going to act to shield the corn from the flames of the grill and roast rather than burn our corn. I'm going to put the corn into a bucket of salted water and allow the husks to get fully saturated. They're going to soak up the water and later prevent burning while we grill. It's also going to effectively steam and roast the corn inside without burning it. The reason I cut off the tops is to allow the steam to escape so the corn doesn't overcook. So we'll leave them in the water for about 2 or 3 hours, not much longer. They just need to be well saturated. With our grill on high, we're going to stack our corn onto the grates. Doesn't matter which direction we put them on. We're not trying to mark them. We just want to expose them to the heat. We're going to set them in here for about 10 minutes, come back, turn them over. You may notice some charring on the husks, but don't worry, it's just on the outside. The corn itself is being nicely roasted and not burned at all. And it's getting that sweet summertime flavor that we all really enjoy. We'll set these for about another 10 minutes, then we'll come back and take them off. They should be fully done. And when we do this, we're going to do a little trick. We're going to pull the corn off, and then we're going to take our ribs, which have been sauced, and we're going to put them back onto the grate of the grill. But we're going to turn the heat off, and we're going to close the lid and let the residual heat warm up the ribs so that they're toasted and ready to go. Plating the ribs couldn't be easier. We've pulled the husk back from the corn cob, and you can see that we've got beautiful golden corn nicely steamed. We cut the ribs into 5 rib sections and included some of that extra meat that we had cooked separately at a little bit lower temperature for a little bit less time. Now you can serve this with a little more sauce on the side if you like, but for me, it's a perfect match between wet and dry. And there it is. I hope you enjoyed this video and picked up a couple of useful tips. I'll be back soon with a recipe for a dessert that perfectly complements this summertime entree. Until then, this is Chef Jack ATL saying thank you, and remember, don't just like, subscribe. Happy 4th of July.